Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Graduate School of Journalism. We're thrilled to have you all here tonight to hear Marion Nestle's talk titled Nutrition Science Under Siege. This is the second lecture in a three-part lecture series that we're calling Food Politics 2019. Last week, Marion talked about food policy in the Trump era, and she'll be back with us next week on Tuesday the 19th at Sibley to talk about an agenda for the food movement. Special thanks to the journalism school's Julie Hirano, who pulled off all the logistics for these events. Please note that at the end of Marion's talk, there will be time for questions from the audience, and also we're live streaming this event, so just be aware of that if you have questions. My name is Malia Wollan. I direct the UC Berkeley 11th Hour Food and Farming Journalism Fellowship here. We give grants to young journalists to cover food, agricultural, and health stories. And we are co-sponsoring this lecture series with the Berkeley Food Institute. I have the pleasure of introducing Marion Nestle. Marion Nestle is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, Public Health. She's emerita at NYU. She got her doctorate in molecular biology and her master's in public health here at Berkeley. It's hard to overstate the pivotal role that Marion Nestle has in our understanding of nutrition and food science in this country. She's the author of 10 books. They're all up there. Food Politics, What to Eat, Why Calories Count, Eat, Drink, Vote, Soda Politics. Her most recent book, Unsavory Truth, How Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat, was published last fall. We're at the journalism school, so it is worth noting that in addition to her role as a scholar and author, Marion has long been a key go-to source for journalists covering these issues. She's often quoted in stories, but also she's an invisible story shaper. She is pointing journalists to stories via her blog, or just she's in the background somewhere educating journalists about these issues. Her fingerprints are everywhere. I've called her and emailed her on multiple occasions myself when I'm working on stories, and every journalist I know who covers this beat has done the same. That's part of why the topic of today's talk is so critical. Science is often viewed by all of us, journalists, consumers, citizens, as objectively true, as fact, and yet Marion has spent years researching and writing about just how the food industry has been funding and manipulating food research and scientific research for decades. Please join me in welcoming Marion Nestle to the journalism school.
Thank you, Malia, for that lovely introduction, and thank all of you for coming. We're having weather tonight, not climate, weather, and it's really nice of you to be here. I thought that this lecture would be the wonkiest and the least controversial of the three lectures that I'm giving, but it turned, and I actually was going to call this lecture in defense of nutrition science, because I find myself in the very peculiar position of wanting to defend nutrition science. So I was extraordinarily surprised to get this tweet this morning. UC Berkeley is home to many great scientists. It's also home to many of the most kooky anti-science activists in America. Guilty as charged, which is why they have Marion Nestle preaching to the crowd, that's you, about how science is a corporate conspiracy again. Really? This comes from Hank Campbell, who was a consultant for the food industry. And it made me think maybe there is a corporate conspiracy and somehow I missed it. Okay, let's take a look. Um, when I turned in the titles for these lectures, it was quite a bit, it was several months ago, certainly before this article came out on January 23rd, Nutrition Research Restoring Respect to a Field Under Siege. Obviously, I'm not the only one who thinks that nutrition science is under siege. Now, you might think that science is, in general is under siege, and it is, but I'm only going to be talking specifically about nutrition science because there are issues about nutrition science that are being specifically attacked. So the starting position is public confusion about food and where to turn for advice and where to turn for answers. My answer to the question is, who can we trust in nutrition? Is me, of course. Um, but people believe that there's enormous conflicting advice, that nutrition research is constantly changing. And in recent years, there's been a flurry of articles about why it's so not only difficult, but impossible to get reliable dietary advice. And the critics of nutrition research, there's so many that I've grouped them into categories. Food companies, of course, who don't like the idea that nutrition research might come up with results that say bad things about the healthfulness of their products. There are scientists with industry ties who consult for industry, like Hank Campbell, who are very eager to defend the food industry. More recently, there have been statisticians, some of them very distinguished. Sociologists have issues, journalists have issues, and I have to say, I have issues. I'm particularly concerned about the food industry's role in trying to discredit nutrition research. So let me go through some of these. Food companies, I'll just give one example. The American Beverage Association, which is the major trade association for Coke, Pepsi, and so forth, during the time when Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York was trying to put a cap on the sizes of sodas, put this full page advertisement into the New York Times: "Are soda and sugar sweetened beverages driving obesity?" Not the way we read the research. So this is part of the industry playbook for casting doubt on the research. It's the first thing you do is you try to discredit the research, attack the science and attack the scientist, because if you can instill doubt about the research, you've won the game. Um, and then there are authors, scientists with ties to food companies, who publish articles like this. The major source of information about dietary intake in the United States is so flawed that you can't rely on any of it for developing dietary guidelines. The failure to measure dietary intake has resulted in a fictional discourse on the effects of dietary sugar, salt, and fat. And this is so fictional that we don't have to pay any attention to it. The authors of these papers are people who receive funding from food industry front groups like the International Life Sciences Institute and companies like Coca-Cola. The same authors have done papers on the fatal flaws of food frequency questionnaires and other memory-based dietary assessment methods. And this is an example of the kind of a food frequency questionnaire. It's a fragment of a food frequency questionnaire. These are notoriously difficult to fill out. How often did you have orange juice, grapefruit juice, and tangerine juice? And you're supposed to remember whether it was once a day, once a week, once a month, or whatever. They're very, very difficult to do. But does that discredit everything in nutrition research? And then we have the statisticians, some of them quite distinguished, particularly John Ioannidis, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly, who's a professor of medicine, health research, and policy at Stanford, who has in recent years made a career of articles that are aimed at discrediting nutrition research, implausible results, unscientific beliefs. That's an article that he co-authored with a group of authors who are very well known for their industry ties. He has other papers limiting dependence on the way these kinds of epidemiological studies are done. Nutrition science has become an epidemic of questionable results. The emerging picture of nutritional epidemiology. You can't reconcile it with good scientific principles. The field needs radical reform. Now, what these people are talking about is epidemiology, which is the science of collecting, in this case, information about dietary intake and disease risk. And this graph is something that I've taken from an editorial that I wrote a couple of years ago in JAMA Internal Medicine. And it shows sugar consumption and saturated fat consumption. Sugar consumption is the little clear circles, saturated fat consumption is the dark circles, and risk of coronary heart disease. And what you can see from this is that there's a pretty clear relationship. The more sugar, saturated fat you have, the more likely you are to have coronary heart disease. But this is an association. There are many other reasons why people in the United States might have high rates of coronary artery disease that have nothing to do with sugar and fat content. And in fact, this graph comes from an editorial about a study that was done by investigators at UCSF who showed that the investigators in this particular study, who were funded by the sugar industry, cherry picked the data in order to show that saturated fat was a more important factor in coronary heart disease than was sugar, when in fact, the epidemiology shows that both were equally correlated, not causal, not necessarily causally. And the issue of causation is a very important one. The Guardian had an article that's claimed that one soft drink a day could increase the risk of cancer. A unfortunately no longer existing website called Health News Review, which evaluated press releases on their scientific credibility, used this as an example to talk about how epidemiological associations are not the same as causation, even though, and partly because the dietary information from these kinds of questionnaires is unreliable, or you don't know how reliable it is. There are many other confounding factors involved in people's lifestyles that could influence their disease risk. And the old saw, more research needed, always. And then there are the sociologists. Georgie Skrinis, who is a sociologist in Australia, published a book a few years ago called Nutritionism, the Science and Politics of Dietary Advice, in which he argues that nutritionists who examine, nutrition researchers who examine the effects of single nutrients are using single nutrients as an indicator of diets or dietary patterns. And you really can't do that, because one way in which nutritionism ends up distorting everything is you get products like these Teddy Grahams, which are basically chocolate covered candy or chocolate covered cookies, but they're high in calcium, iron, and zinc, and they're being marketed as a health food. Nutritionism is very much a factor in United States dietary guidelines. I've complained for years that whenever the guidelines talk about what you're supposed to eat more of, they talk about food, fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, whole foods, meat, dairy foods, but real foods. when they talk about what you're supposed to eat more of. When they talk about what you're supposed to eat less of, they revert to nutritionism and talk about nutrients. They use sodium as a euphemism for the main sources of sodium in American diets, snacks, and junk food. They use saturated fat as a euphemism for the source of saturated fat, which means hamburgers and meat and often dairy products. And added sugars are a euphemism for soft drinks. So the nutritionism story has some merit to it. And then there are journalists. And the journalists have recently discovered that nutrition is a fun thing to attack. You can't trust what you read about nutrition. Journalists have discovered that epidemiology is about association and not causation, and write long and complicated articles about it. Some of them are a lot of fun. This one has a correlation between cabbage and innie belly buttons. I don't know where that comes from. The point being that you can correlate anything with anything. And then we have Nina Teicholz, a journalist who wrote a book called The Big Fat Surprise, who wrote an article for the British Medical Journal, now called the BMJ, um, arguing that the science behind the dietary guidelines is so flawed that you really don't have to pay any attention to it. And her article itself had a lot of flaws in it. And on that basis, Center for Science in the Public Interest and Advocacy Group in Washington, D.C., um, called for retraction. There was a big brouhaha about it. The BMJ did not retract the article, but they did publish several sets of corrections to her article. So it's a big deal. Very public, very big deal. And I have to say, it surprises me. And it surprises me for two reasons. One is the limits of epidemiology are not exactly news. This is a textbook from 1996 on nutritional assessment that lays out the issues in nutritional epidemiology as clearly as anybody possibly could. It makes the point that nutritional epidemiology and food frequency questionnaires have real uses. If you want to get information from a lot of individuals at low cost, easily, with something that you can put into a computer and add up quickly, food frequency questionnaires are a great way to do it. On the other hand, they have real limitations. They may not represent the usual intake or portion sizes of the respondents. The data can be compromised when multiple foods are grouped within single listings. They completely depend on the memory of the people who are filling out the questionnaires. And I can tell you from my standpoint, they're really hard to fill out. I can't remember. And they're not appropriate for certain purposes. So it's not as if anything was new. It's that the statisticians are just discovered this. Well, okay, fine. The second issue that surprises me is what's the alternative? Here's an article that came out in January in the New York Times Magazine. Perhaps it's time to rigorously research what we eat and why. What does the author think scientists have been doing up until now? We should do this the same way we study other molecules we put in our bodies. That would be great. I think that's a terrific idea. How does the author suggest that we do this? And just to make the point, if you think about it for a minute, it's really hard to study the diets of populations. Diets vary. They vary between me and you, and even my own diet varies very much from day to day, and I'm willing to bet that yours does too. Lifestyles vary that might influence disease risk. It's very difficult to control for lifestyle factors. We can't lock people up into cages or metabolic wards and study them for the 30 or 40 years that it takes to develop coronary artery disease. We're not allowed to do nutrition experiments on prisoners anymore because they're informed consent. They can't, there's no such thing as informed consent in prison. And you can't do it on rats because they're not humans. And then there's the microbiome. I don't know what to say about the microbiome, except that it influences everything, and we need to find out more about it. So, this makes nutrition research very difficult to do. If you're going to criticize it, please give me an alternative for how you would discover the nutritional intake of populations without doing these kinds of studies. I mean, these are the really important questions in nutrition these days, I think. What do people typically eat? Oh, how I wish we had an easier and more reliable way to figure that out. How does diet affect chronic disease risk? That's the one we all want to know about. How do specific dietary components affect the risk, or do they? Does it make any difference one food or another? And how can we encourage people to eat more healthfully? It seems to me those are the really important questions in nutrition research these days. And I think for that reason, and because the alternative is very difficult to figure out, the main nutritional epidemiologists have published their own defenses have been called on to defend their own work. This is Walter Willett and Frank Hu's editorial in JAMA, in which they point out that nutritional epidemiology, interpreted in the context of all other evidence, is essential. And they use three examples to demonstrate how important it has been in identifying the coronary risk of trans fats, in showing how sugar sweetened beverages affect health, and in helping to define healthy diets. So they have a big defense of it. They also are doing their own critiques of various aspects of nutrition research. And in particular, they picked on meta analysis. Meta analysis is when you take lots and lots of studies and put them all together and look at them as a whole in order to get better statistical strength from the results of those studies. And they argue in this particular paper, also from JAMA, that the food industry is well aware of the power of science-driven headlines and has invested in meta-analyses, and in the process, nutrition science may be adversely affected. And that brings me to my latest book, Unsavory Truth: How Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat, in which I did an analysis of food industry funding of nutrition research. And to my surprise, after the book was in press, JAMA, or while the book was in its last stages, JAMA came out with a whole issue on conflict of interest. Science came out with an issue on conflicts of interest, and another issue on science in general under scrutiny, in which they talked about meta research. Meta research is the word that's given to the study of the way science is being conducted. And I discovered by reading that I'm a meta researcher. I had no idea. But let me tell you a little bit about why I thought a book about food industry funding of research was necessary, and why I think that food industry funded research is in a category of its own. Let me just start with a recent example. In March 2018, the New York Times came out with a very long article, an investigative report on how the alcohol industry had given $67 million to the National Institutes of Health, how the National Institutes of Health had courted the alcohol industry in order to get this money. And the article demonstrated that there was alcohol industry influence on the investigators, on the design of the study, and on the outcome, on the promised outcome of the study. The investigators had essentially promised the alcohol industry that the study would be designed in a way to demonstrate that one drink a day reduced the risk for heart disease, and it would not be run long enough to show any possible effect on breast cancer risk. This is pretty shocking. This is National Institutes of Health. It's the main government agency that deals with this. This was the Alcohol Institute that got involved in this. And I should say that the reporter who wrote this story told me that she had written a preliminary story before this about it and got a tip from somebody at the Alcohol Institute telling her that there was more to the story that she had written and she should dig in a little bit harder. And she did a terrific job on that. Well, this was a scandal. And it was a scandal for NIH, and NIH acted on it immediately. In March, the head of NIH announced that they were going to do an investigation of the Alcohol Institute to find out how this had happened. They halted enrollment in the study a month later, and then, or a few months later. And then when the report of the investigative group came out, it was absolutely scathing about the behavior and the conflicts of interest among the people at the NIH Alcohol Institute. The NIH stopped the study, even though they had already spent $4 million on it. They stopped it. Well, I'm not talking about alcohol in this book. I'm talking about food companies and the makers of the products we know and love. This is a very concentrated industry these days. This is the 10 largest food companies and what they do. And what I find so interesting about all of this is how little observation there is about how this industry influences research. For example, if you go online and ask the question, what affects our choice of food, you're going to get a diagram like this. There are dozens of them under images on Google. And what I find amazing about these is they don't say one word about the food industry influencing what people eat. They talk about lifestyle. They talk about cost, health, and religion. They talk about regional variations and availability and your ability to cook. They say not one word about food industry influence, as if it doesn't exist. Um, and so I think we need to sort of refocus the discussion a little bit and look at the role of food companies in research and rebalance the discussion of whether your individual choice is what matters or whether you're being manipulated in that choice. So I want to refocus the discussion. And one way to do that is to look at the dietary guidelines. This is the same slide I showed you. Um, the guidelines recommend more of whole foods, fruits, vegetables, meat, dairy, and so forth, and less of junk foods. But this raises a real problem because it's the junk foods, it's the food products that are the really profitable unicorns in the food industry. Fruits, vegetables, and whole foods are not nearly as profitable for food companies who can make products, buy the ingredients cheaply, and leave them on the shelf for long periods of time. Now, I've been writing about this actually for a long time. I wrote my first article about food industry induced conflicts of interest in 2001. I incorporated quite a bit of that article into Food Politics, which came out in 2002. And then I kind of forgot about it. And in 2015, when I was writing food soda politics about the soda industry, I encountered the whole business about, well, it's mostly Coca-Cola's funding of research as I was doing the research for that book. And I talked about it in that. And I've written a couple of articles since looking at food industry influence on nutrition research, professional societies, and the advice that government gives. And then while soda politics was kind of going into press, I was kind of sensitized to Coca-Cola funding. And I started noticing that a lot of studies coming across my desk were funded by food companies of one kind or another. And in March 2015, I started collecting them on my website, foodpolitics.com. And anytime I had 5 industry funded studies, I would post them on my website. They almost invariably had results that favored the sponsor's interest. At the end of, I did that for a year. And at the end of the year, I had 168 studies, of which 156 had results that were favorable to the sponsor's interest. Only 12 did not, even though I begged readers of my blog to send me studies that were funded by food companies that came out with results that didn't come out the way they wanted to. Now, this was what is known as a convenience sample. It's just what I ran across or what people sent me. I wasn't systematically searching the literature for it. So the only conclusion I could really draw was that it's a lot easier to find industry funded studies that favor the sponsor's interest than the opposite. But nevertheless, there was information to be gained. And one was the extraordinary number of trade associations and companies that were funding this kind of research. The list is very, very long and includes a lot of healthy foods as well as unhealthy foods, junk foods as well as things that you probably believe are going to be fantastic health foods. Everybody was doing it. And I was seeing so much of this that I got to the point where I could recognize who the sponsor was by the title of the study. Here, for example, here's an example. Polyphenol rich mangoes are better for symptoms of constipation than equivalent amounts of fiber. Who would do a study like that? Bingo, the National Mango Board. I mean, totally predictable. Here's another one. The effect of nut consumption on semen quality and functionality in healthy men. The conclusion of this, the inclusion of nuts in a Western style diet significantly improves total sperm count and the vitality, motility, and morphology of the sperm. Yes. And who sponsored it? The International Nut and Dried Fruit Council. I mean, these things are totally predictable. I love mangoes. I want to go on record as saying I love mangoes. I love nuts. But really? I mean, this defies credulity in diets that are complicated. I mean, I think nuts are great, but anyway, but what really got me going on this book and what really induced me to say, I got to write this book, was an article in the New York Times in August 2015. It was on the front page. And it announced that Coca-Cola had funded an effort to alter the obesity battle because Coca-Cola had been funding researchers who stressed exercise as more important than calories or what you eat in the development of obesity. And this was so shocking that even Fox News was shocked. I was quoted in this article, and I got a lot of calls from reporters in the week it came out. And I have to say the reporters were shocked. They were astonished that Coca-Cola would fund studies like this. They were astonished that researchers would take money from Coca-Cola for doing studies like this. And they were astonished that universities would allow their faculty to take money from Coca-Cola for doing this kind of thing. Obviously, they knew nothing, and I had another book to write. The story was particularly shocking because one of the investigators, Stephen Blair, who's in exercise physiology, had a video on the web in which he said that scientists and the press were always blaming fast food, sugary drinks, and so on for obesity. And he said there's really no compelling evidence that that, in fact, is the cause of obesity. He neglected to mention in this video that the Global Energy Balance Network was funded by Coca-Cola. And so it was the finding out and the investigation, interesting investigative report story, finding out about that was so shocking to everybody. So this was a scandal. And Coca-Cola was very embarrassed. The head of Coca-Cola said, this doesn't reflect our company. We really have ethics. We're going to go completely transparent. We're going to post on our website the amount of money that we spend on research, and we're going to list the names of every researcher, every dietitian, every nutritionist, every individual to whom we give money. And to my utter astonishment, they did that. And they did it right away. They said they would keep it up every 6 months, and they have done that. And all you have to do is Google Coca-Cola transparency. I highly recommend it. It's really fun. Um, if you like gossip, it's really fun. So the most recent one says that they have spent $147 million on partnerships and research between 2010 and 2018. And they're redoing their whole way in which they're funding research. But the fact that they went transparent allowed analysis, and researchers moved right in. And researchers at UCSF asked the question, do sugar sweetened beverages cause obesity and diabetes? They should have said associated, but they used cause. Okay. They found 26 studies that said no, sugar sweetened beverages have nothing to do with obesity and diabetes. 25 of those were funded by the industry. They found 34 studies that said yes, sugar sweetened beverages have plenty to do with obesity and diabetes, and only one of those was funded by industry. I'm guessing that one never got funded again by industry, but never mind. So this kind of validated my casual collection. Much of the research, there's been an enormous amount of research on the effect of industry funding on research. A lot of that was done for cigarettes, chemicals, and the pharmaceutical drug industry. And I'll just talk here about the the drug industry's research on this question because it's gone on for so long and there's so much of it. The first book that I was able to find on drug industry funding of research came out in 1974. There's still things coming out all the time. And this research, to kind of summarize it very quickly, it's the research, thousands of studies and libraries full of books say that sponsored research almost invariably comes out in favor of the sponsor's interest, that the influence of sponsorship or gifts is there, whether their gifts are large or small. Larger gifts have a bigger influence, but even something as small as a pen and a pad of paper is enough to convince a physician to change prescription practices to the industry's brand name product. The influence, and this is the hard part, the influence of industry funding and gifts is generally unconscious, it's unintentional, and it's unrecognized. So the researchers who are the recipients of industry funding don't realize that it influences them. They think it doesn't, and they deny that it influences them. Therefore, their justifications for taking the money are largely invalid, and disclosure of the funding is necessary, but it's not sufficient to manage the problem. So that's the result those are the results of an enormous amount of research. In contrast, I was only able to find 11 studies on food industry funding of research on nutrition and health. Those 11 studies came out between 2003 and 2018. They're very recent. They varied in the product, the health effect, the method, and the outcome, although most of them were on sugary drinks. But in general, I think it's fair to conclude that those studies showed that industry-funded research favors the sponsor's interest. They showed that the place where the bias came up most readily was in the way the research question was framed. And they also put a positive spin on neutral results. So if the study came out saying, well, there was no difference, they interpreted it positively. Now, there's been research on how this happens, and a lot of that research was done by Lisa Biro, who used to be at UCSF and is now at the University of Sydney. And she has written articles about how bias gets into research design and so forth. And her research generally, the research of her group generally points out that the influence is most easily seen in the research agenda. And I can understand this because I get letters all the time from trade associations for grapes, pecans, yogurt, any food product that you can think of, asking for proposals for research studies that will demonstrate the benefits of those products. There is a big difference between designing a study to demonstrate benefits and designing a study to find out what the effects are. Those are two completely different research questions. It's really easy to design a study to show benefit. It's not very hard to do that. And if you want to know how to do that, I'm not going to show this video because it's it's almost 5 minutes, but this is a fabulous video from a man named Michael Greger, who does fabulous videos, Nutrition Facts Organization, um, in which he demonstrates how the dairy industry designs studies to show that dairy products are good for health and disguises any I can't get this off and won't you thank you very much and disguises any negative effects of dairy products on health. And he said, as he points out, the issues are in how long the study is run, who the participants are, what the protocols are for the study, and what the comparison diets are. What are you comparing it to? And it's really easy to do this, and this one's fun to watch. Now, industry funding has consequences. It's not a trivial matter. I think that it raises scientific risks and personal risks. The scientific research risks are distortions in the way the research question is asked, in the results of the research, in the way the research is interpreted, in the dietary advice that results from the research, and it reduces trust in nutrition. And that's a big problem. That's really why I'm talking about this. For researchers themselves who take industry funding, there are what are called opportunity costs. That is, there are certain prestigious committees and certain prestigious things that go on that they're not going to be invited to because they're going to be viewed as working for industry and not independent scientists. They risk being exposed in the press. This can be very embarrassing, and they can appear sold out to their colleagues. So that's kind of the things that concern me. But I have to say, um, there's a big debate in the nutrition field about the issue of industry funding. Is it good, bad, or indifferent? There are people on all different sides of that question. There are some people who think that partnerships between researchers or health organizations and the food industry risk derailing public health and nutrition. There are others who think we should welcome industry funding. It's a really good thing. And there are others that look at the whole question of public-private partnerships and the evolving role of industry, showing that industry is really benign. I have nutrition colleagues who feel that the issue of industry funding is a red herring and that you don't need to pay any attention to it at all. They published an article a few years ago called White Hat Bias. White hat was how you identified the good guys in cowboy movies. So they were arguing in this article that industry funding has no influence. It's really irrelevant to the scientific enterprise. Any criticism of research that is funded by industry is an ad hominem attack on the researchers. That is a personal attack on the researchers, and they take it as a personal attack. And that things like career goals, your scientific beliefs, your dietary practices are just as biasing as industry funding. And then all you have to do is disclose your industry funding, and you have taken care of the problem. Well, I don't think that's right. I think all of those are false. I'll just give a couple of examples. This isn't a nutrition researcher, but this was a big article in the New York Times last September, where a top cancer researcher at Sloan Kettering was outed by not disclosing his corporate financial ties in his articles in research journals, because Congress requires drug companies to disclose everybody that they give money to and how much money they give. And there's a website. You can just go on the website and look, it's right there. It was really easy for people to find out this information. And they published, the Times published this great big long list of all of the drug companies that he was associated with as an advisor or consultant or whatever. His response to this was that his not disclosing his industry contacts didn't compromise his responsibilities as a physician, as a scientist, and as a clinical researcher, a classic denial of the role of the influence of industry funding. Now, our favorite statisticians have also taken on the question of um, disclosure. Um, Ioannidis has an article on implausible results in human nutrition research, in which he says that given that fanatical opinions abound in nutrition, you have to do something to minimize this kind of bias. Or he went even further in another article, why disclosure in nutrition research is different than disclosure for any other in any other field. He argued that it was important for nutrition researchers to disclose their advocacy or activist work as well as their dietary preferences. If you're a vegan on the Atkins diet, gluten-free, or eating a high animal protein diet or specific supplements, he specified you ought to disclose those in your work. So I thought, I better disclose, right? So here's my standard conflict of interest disclosure from last year or from 2 years ago before I retired, that my salary supports my research and my website, but I also earn royalties in books and honorary and travel from lectures about matters relevant to what I'm writing about. And I'm an omnivore. According to Google Images, an omnivore is an eater, consumer, glutton, gourmet, diner, epicure, devourer, gorger, bon vivant, or gastronomer, guilty as charged. But what about the question of ideological biases or career biases? The idea that you need to disclose in your articles that your promotion and job depend on getting this article published. Well, here again, Lisa Biro comes to the rescue and has done a great deal of research on the question of what constitutes a conflict of interest. And in her view, and absolutely in mine, industry funding is in a class by itself. Because if you're doing basic science, the purpose of basic science is to advance knowledge or public health. You're going to have hypotheses about the kind of work that you're doing. These are absolutely intrinsic to the scientific process. You can't do science without hypotheses. You have to have hypotheses. You want those hypotheses to be you want your research to demonstrate those hypotheses. The results of your study are going to be multi-directional depending on what your hypothesis is. Lots of people have lots of different kinds of hypotheses. These are going to come out in lots of different ways depending on what those hypotheses are. Industry funded research is different, and decidedly different. Its purpose is to promote new products or promote marketing in one way or another. It's not really about science, it's about marketing. Industry funding is optional to the scientific process. You can do science without industry funding. You really can. You can find other ways to do it. And the results are largely unidirectional. They're predictable from the titles of the studies. So I think they're really different. And those who are doing nutrition epidemiology and who are concerned about restoring respect to this field under siege argue that, like any other field, we should strive to improve the scientific rigor and reproducibility of our studies. The question is, how are they going to do that? And I'm very interested to see in January, or a week or so, a month ago, less than a month ago, the American Society for Nutrition, which is the major nutrition organization for doctoral level scientists, researchers, and clinicians in nutrition, about 3 years ago, put together what they call the Blue Ribbon Panel on trust in nutrition science. And that panel uh, recently came out with its report. It was published in January with a report and an accompanying commentary. And the panel members reviewed everything that I've talked about, and also talked about the real concern about restoring trust in nutrition science and what they would have to do it. And I was particularly interested in what they were going to say about funding of this particular organization, because this is an organization that takes quite a bit of food industry money, and also has position papers and takes positions on issues that are very, very much favorable to the food industry rather than to public health. And in my book, Unsavory Truth, I give several examples of that. Well, it turns out the commission could not reach consensus on that point. They were unable to reach consensus. There were some people who thought that the American Society for Nutrition shouldn't take any industry money at all. And there were others who thought that they should take industry money, but under certain circumstances. And so the report of the um, of the of the Blue Ribbon Panel listed the two options. The American Society of Nutrition should enter into partnerships with food companies only when these are supported exclusively by membership resources or not-for-profit entities with no conflicts of interest. Or alternatively, it should develop a rigorous, transparent approach to co-sponsoring and managing activities that are financially supported by food companies, is really what it said. So on its website, it has a ballot where you can vote. And you do not have to be a member of the society to vote. You have to declare whether you're a member of the society, but you don't have to be a member of the society to vote. Go ahead and vote. Have some fun with this. So, what is to be done? The last chapter of my book, I have recommendations for researchers, food companies, reporters, and eaters about what to do about conflicts of interest and how to handle food industry funding. And the basic bottom line is that everybody who is dealing with nutrition research should be on the lookout for certain buzzwords that should raise red flags and make everybody bring out their skeptical antenna. Anytime you see the word breakthrough, that's not how nutrition science works. Miracles, that's another one. Be concerned about single foods, because that's not how diets work. Be concerned about anything that's absolute. Saturated fat is good for your health. Be a little careful. Anything where one food or one nutrient does cures for multiple diseases. It's very unlikely that eating nuts is going to take care of your sperm motility problems. I'm sorry. Or that blueberries will cure everything. And then my absolute favorite is anytime you see everything you thought you knew about nutrition is wrong, that is almost certainly not the way science works, and not the way nutrition science works in particular. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions. Wait, do we need to do microphone?
Yeah, for the live stream.
Okay, so he who has the microphone has the floor.
Would peer review of these research papers help?
Oh, these papers are peer reviewed. They are peer reviewed. And as a peer reviewer myself, I can tell you that if I see a paper that is with a title that I can recognize that I can predict the funder, and sure enough, it's that funder, I reject the paper. I just say, this is a standard industry funded study. This is a marketing study. Don't publish it in this. But I don't think there are very many other people who notice. The editors of nutrition journals themselves have industry ties often. In my profession, I don't see it considered as a serious problem very much. So I don't think peer review is going to solve it, unfortunately. I wrote the book to try to raise consciousness about it and to make people a little queasy about letting these things go through. Whether it will work or not, I don't know yet. The book's only been out for a couple of months. And so far, the reaction I'm getting is like that first tweet.
Hi, I have a question. I see what you're saying about sort of watching who's funding what research and how basic science should really be done in a different way. But I'm wondering, like, structurally, if you see this as a huge problem, because I imagine that these industries have loads of money and they're doing more than just funding specific research, but funding whole departments and parts of universities, and that it influences much broader swaths of all of society than necessarily something you can just check by trying to be more scientific.
Yeah, I mean, the Coca-Cola funding of the Global Energy Balance Network was a really good example, because they gave the University of Colorado $1 million grant to fund that work. And in the wake of the scandal over that, the university gave it back. That, I mean, for any of you who know anything about university funding, you should be gasping at how astonishing that is. Universities are in terrible financial problems. Many universities ask faculty to go out and look for industry funding. This is a huge problem, I think. An absolutely huge problem. You know, the main recommendation should be, we need more independent funding for research. Where are we going to get it in this, under the present way that government is working? I don't know. But I think it's something that scientists have to be really careful about. But you're absolutely right about that. Yes.
Do any of these transparency measures account for the use of shell organizations or subsidiaries?
I'm not sure. When I was writing Unsavory Truth, when I got to the end of the book, I ran across something from the International Life Sciences Institute, and I thought, I think I've already written this. Maybe I should do, by that time I had a complete manuscript and I could search it. And I did a search for that organization, and I was shocked to find that I had mentioned it 20 times throughout the book. The International Life Sciences Institute, ILSI, has a finger in everything, every aspect of food and nutrition research and practice. They're in there, and they're very quiet. Although articles just came out in the BMJ and the Journal of Public Health Policy about ILSI's work in China that got a lot of press nationally. Lots of people wrote articles about these articles demonstrating that ILSI had influenced the Chinese government to focus on physical activity as a way to address obesity, rather than trying to get people to drink fewer sodas or eat less junk food. So you have to know that these are industry-funded groups, and the issue of front groups is a complicated one. They don't always disclose, as this one did not disclose until it got caught, the Global Energy Balance Network.
So are there any studies about organic foods? Are they better?
That's interesting that you mention it, because I can tell who funded a study by what the results are. If the studies say organic foods are more nutritious, I can bet that somebody from the Organic Research Foundation funded it. And if they say they're not more nutritious. I can bet that somebody from some organization that hates organics funded it. I was asked years ago to consult with the Organic Research Foundation about what kind of research they should be doing, and I and others advised them not to fund this kind of research because it wouldn't look good. And it was the wrong question anyway. Organics are about production values. And there's no question, I mean, the study just came out this week that children who consume organic foods have lower level of pesticides in their blood. That's been known for a long time, but it's nice to see another study of it. They're about production values. They're not about nutrients.
I was wondering whether the really reputable scientific organizations that you have to get nominated to be part of them, if they have any ethics or standards about what behavior the scientists can engage in terms of accepting funding.
The American Society of Nutrition, the year after the scandal about the Global Energy Balance Network, gave three of its top awards to two people who were involved in the network and to an official at Coca-Cola who participated in the network. Of the you mean other organizations? I don't know what other organizations do, but this is the top research organization for nutritionists, and and the organization itself doesn't do those awards. Those awards are done by committees, and the people who are on the committees that appointed those people to those awards might not have known about the scandal or might not have cared. There's no way of telling. I don't know who they were, but I thought it was telling that these three people who were involved in a front page, continuing on to a full page on the inside of the New York Times, I mean, a really big article, had won prizes from the organization. So it clearly was not a factor.
At the beginning of the lecture, you mentioned that there weren't studies on humans following a particular diet, I think, to prove or disprove like sugar's bad or sugar's good. But I think if you use epidemiological data on people who follow low carb diets, wouldn't that be the same as any of the other studies? And also there's a gentleman named Steve Finney who runs Verta Health, which is an online site that walks type 2 diabetics through going on a low carb diet and getting them off insulin and turning around their diabetes. That's, I think, great data for people to use to follow what's happening with macronutrients and nutrition.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the defense of epidemiological research. And there are certainly situations in which you can do well-controlled research. For example, the Loma Linda University, which is a Seventh-day Adventist, and they're mostly vegetarian. Well, it turns out as Adventists practice different levels of vegetarianism. There's some who are essentially vegan and some who eat quite a bit of meat. It depends on what their particular practices are. And so researchers at Loma Linda have done comparative studies of various levels. These are sort of a natural, what you're talking about is a natural experiment. It's when you put people, and these show that the more vegetarian the diets are, the healthier they are. That's some of the basic research demonstrating the value of eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. It's the other kinds of studies where you want to look at people who are eating a normal run-of-the-mill American diet, and you want to compare them to people who are eating low carb diets. Well, how do you control that the people who say they're eating low carb diets really are eating low carb diets. The best studies that have been done on the low carb, low fat issue show that people's diets tend to change over time, and that there are some differences, but you got to account for calories too. Makes it complicated. So yes and no. There's quite a lot of information that can be gained from epidemiology, but it's not a perfect science. And the attack on it, it seems to me, is very troubling, because it plays into the goals of food companies who are eager not to have anybody say anything bad about their products. No.
You showed a slide earlier that had James Hill in it, and I don't recall what the research was, but I'm wondering, as I'm connecting the dots as you're giving your talk, America on the Move, his organization, did they take in food industry money?
I actually don't know in that organization, but he was one of the leaders of the Global Energy Balance Network, which took money from Coca-Cola. But I don't know about this other organization. He was also one of the people who won a prize at the American Society for Nutrition. No.
Hi. I read a little bit of criticism about industry funding with the Eat Lancet reports. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that. Is there any conflict of interest there that you could talk about?
Yeah. The Eat Lancet report, which came out a few weeks ago, is this 50-page paper in the journal The Lancet. It's a British medical journal. And the report was a recommended dietary practices that reduce the dietary practices that would improve health and reduce climate change at the same time. They united agriculture and health policy and made recommendations for that if we really want to reduce the impact of the way we produce and consume food on health and on the environment, we need to eat about half as much meat as we're eating. We need to eat more fruits and vegetables. The advice that the Eat Lancet report gave was pretty mainstream dietary advice, not all that different from what dietary guidelines have been saying since 1980. But it's been attacked because Walter Willett, who was the chair of the commission who did that, is a pretty strong vegetarian, and or certainly has very strong vegetarian leanings, if not vegan leanings, although he's not a vegan. And so he was accused of having ideological interests in the outcome of this commission's research review. The EAT, which is not the Lancet, it's an organization that comes out of Sweden, which I actually don't know very much about, and I'm going to have to find out more about it. But it apparently gets money from Nestle, no relation, and Unilever, and some other major food companies. I'm not sure why those companies would fund this or what they get out of it. I'm quite puzzled by that. But I've seen those criticisms. I can't see an immediate benefit to Unilever or Nestle for having recommendations to eat less meat, and certainly fewer processed foods with salt, sugar, and saturated fat. Both of those companies make processed foods. So I'm kind of puzzled by the whole thing. I'm sorry. Oh, they make infant formulas, right? Well, Nestle certainly does. Adult formulas. You could do it that way. But that's pretty far-fetched. I don't really know what the connection is. I'm going to have to find out more about it. But I'm certainly aware of the criticism of it. Doesn't quite make sense to me, but that could be. Yeah.
You mentioned the microbiome earlier.
I did.
Have you seen any industry funding in that sphere or in the sphere of immunology generally?
Well, I only look at food industry funding. Yes, on the microbiome. Yes, definitely. There have been studies they look like basic research studies to me. So I don't know what to say about them. I mean, they're not the kinds of things that I put in my book as examples of egregious food industry marketing interests. In fact, there's an enormous interest by everybody in what the microbiome is about. It's the most exciting thing that's happened in nutrition research in decades since vitamins. And there's lots to be learned about it. I don't think there are any conclusions that anybody can draw yet, but it's certainly fascinating. And there are some food companies that are funding microbiome studies, mainly to show either that if you eat a particular food, it will make the microbiome healthier, or if you don't eat, or if you switch around the diet, that it'll change. I don't know how they do this in any way that makes much sense. So I don't know what it means yet, but they are funding them. Whoever has the microphone gets yeah.
Can you comment on some of the benefits and downfalls of using NHANES data in nutrition research?
NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, is the largest government survey of dietary intake. It's been going on for decades. And they try to do a really, really good job. It's as good as the research using these kinds of studies can be. They take a statistically developed sample of the United States population, usually enriched in minority groups, depending on what they're looking at. And they ask those individuals to come into some kind of trailer for in person, to be interviewed about their dietary intake, to give blood, to take samples of urine and these kinds of things. The dietary intake surveys are done with models and questionnaires that are done in different kinds of ways. They try to cross-check to make sure that the dietary intake information is correct. I think it's 2 days of dietary intake. They try really, really hard to track down those 12,000 individuals or whatever the number is, and to make sure that every individual who is identified as part of the statistical sample actually comes in and is measured. So it's as good as this kind of information can be. Does that mean that it's perfect? No. Does it mean that it's flawed? Yes. But it's what we've got. And so to argue that the methods of NHANES are so poor that you don't have to pay attention to them, which is what studies funded by Coca-Cola tended to say, it seems to me is not very helpful. And the NHANES is the main source of dietary information demonstrating problems with high sugar and high sugary beverage intake. So you can understand why Coca-Cola would not want that data to be taken seriously. I don't know what to say about it. It's as good as we've got.
Marion, can you talk more about the dietary guidelines and what happened in 2015 to, where the meat industry got pretty upset, and then it became this whole distorted conversation about science and how that's actually resulted in a completely different approach the federal government's taking in 2020 to how the guidelines are being done?
Yeah, I mean, the dietary guidelines are very political. I think it's fair to say that. Before there were chronic diseases, in the days when everybody worried about vitamin deficiencies, nutrition research was very uncontroversial. It didn't really become controversial until people started talking about what you needed to eat less of in order to prevent heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and so forth. The 2015 dietary guidelines were Well, first of all, there's a process issue. The process of the dietary guidelines is that a committee is appointed, and that's a scientific committee. It reviews the research since the last set of guidelines, 5 years, and then writes a research report. That research report is then taken by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Agriculture and turned into the actual dietary guidelines that are published. When I was on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in 1995, we wrote the guidelines. The advisory committee wrote the guidelines. That changed under George W. Bush, and the process became much more political, and it was when it was turned over to the agencies. The agencies alternate lead responsibility. 2015, Health and Human Services was in charge. The committee that wrote the dietary guidelines said that you should eat less meat, not only for reasons of health, but also for reasons of sustainability. So they were trying to link agriculture policy to health policy, which is what the big push is these days. Immediately, the meat industry complained. They complained to the Secretary of Agriculture. The Secretary of Agriculture said months before the dietary guidelines were released that they would not contain the word sustainability. And if you go online and check, they don't. But that was a decision that was made months in advance. And then the meat industry said, well, the science isn't there. Always you cast doubt on the science. It's the first thing you do when you don't like what's being said. And the Department of Agriculture bought it. And, the Health and Human Services didn't say much, but it's not there. I was a reviewer on the dietary guidelines original manuscript. I was kind of floored by how bad it was. And I had a lot to say about it. But even so, I couldn't believe what came out of it. The most bizarre thing in the guidelines is the business about cholesterol and eggs. Eggs are the largest source of cholesterol in American diets. The guidelines said you don't have to worry about cholesterol. It's not a problem. And then they said, but you should eat as little cholesterol as possible. Huh? I mean, I don't know. But what happened after that, because the sustainability issue is focused on meat, the meat industry has gathered together all of its resources to try to keep the dietary guidelines from saying anything bad about meat, and certainly keeping climate change out of the equation. And I don't know what the relationship is between the meat industry and Nina Teicholz's Nutrition Coalition, which is a group that's funded by the Arnold Foundation, to lobby to keep meat and saturated fat as desirable qualities in the dietary guidelines. And I think because they had so much lobbying money behind them, they actually got meetings with the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of Agriculture took it very seriously. This is agriculture's year for lead responsibility, and they have made it, the Department of Agriculture has made it very clear that it intends to exercise that lead responsibility and to control the process. And I don't know how it's going to come up. The committee hasn't been appointed yet. Or let me put it another way. The committee may have been appointed, but nobody's announced it publicly. They're at least a year and a half behind where they should be for the 2020 dietary guidelines. And I have no inside information. I'm just waiting. Can't wait to see who's been appointed to that committee. I don't envy anybody who's on that committee. It's going to be, there'll be a microscope on anybody who serves on that committee.
Hi, can you comment on a shift in focus from saturated fat to sugar on cardiovascular health?
Well, there are a lot of people who have discovered sugar again. And as if it hasn't been an issue for a long time, the dietary guidelines have always said eat less sugar, but they didn't start talking about sugar as a factor in chronic disease until rather recently. They talked about tooth decay. But there's been, there are those articles that I mentioned that in the 1960s that looked like they were pushing the research to focus more on saturated fat than sugar. I'm a calorie person. I've written a book called Why Calories Count, or co-authored a book, Why Calories Count from Science to Politics. I don't think you could take sugar or saturated fat out of the calorie context. And they both count. The studies that have examined the risk, the sugars and saturated fats, I mean, they come out showing that calories have a lot to do with it, and you can't really distinguish diets as a whole. But you have fabulous science writer like Gary Taubes, who writes that sugar is the most important problem that carries a lot of weight and influences a lot of people. And he's not alone in thinking that. Robert Lustig at UCSF is another one who thinks that sugar is poison. So these kinds of things go in cycles. But as I think everybody would be well off eating less sugar. I'm for eating less sugar. On the other hand, I'm not for eating no sugar. No, not at all. Life is short. Eat dessert first.
Hi, Marion. Going back to what Michelle was saying about the dietary guidelines. Canada has a new guideline that just came out. And so what I was hearing, I think it was Yoni, he was on a podcast. He's Canadian, right? I think, yeah. So how did they do it? How did they, apparently focused more on non-industry funded research, and somehow they were able to get an industry influence out of finalizing the guideline and removing dairy as a food group and water instead of dairy or milk. So do you know anything about that? And I know in other global dietary guidelines like Brazil, focuses more on life pattern or the meal pattern and so forth, and other things about eating. So how could the US go in that direction?
Yeah, I know more about Brazil than I do about Canada. I don't know how the Canadians did it. I don't know who was on the committee. I don't know. I know that there was a lot of scrutiny on the Canadian guidelines about industry influence, and maybe they just made enough noise so they were able to keep industry out of it. The Brazil guidelines I know a little bit more about because there's a professor at the University of São Paulo, Carlos Monteiro, who led that enterprise and put an enormous amount of research and effort into trying to get those guidelines the way they were supposed to be. And they were able to do that in a government situation that allowed them to do that. What's going to happen under the present government, I have no idea. But we're in a situation in which industry has a lot of power. And the Department of Agriculture, my depressing last talk was largely about what the Department of Agriculture is doing to undermine healthy food and nutrition policies in every conceivable way. The latest being saying that pink slime can now be considered hamburger for school meals. I love that. I was sorry that wasn't there for last week. That just happened this week. No. So I don't know enough about the politics of Canada. Are we done? Last but least, not least, last but not least. Done? Done. Thank you very much.